are back with Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno and our wonderful guest today, Freddy Silva, author and speaker, TV producer, and expert in crop circles and sacred places, and that's just what we're talking about. Now, Freddy, before we went on the break there, we were talking about more in-depth matters having to do with crop circles, consciousness, and this sort of thing. And I'm still interested in the ancient knowledge that people had, and we certainly agreed that our ancestors were a lot smarter than we thought they were. Are you suggesting that these benign entities told them where to put their temples, or the energy lines were such that they knew where to put the temples, or how did that work?
Probably a bit of both. If you look back at a lot of the myths that have been transmitted over the course of 12,000 years, and certainly preceding the flood, there are all of these scriptures all around the world that talk about how these gods basically taught the people where to look and position their sacred temples so they can always go and communicate with the invisible universe. To me, I believe that their interpretation of gods is very different to ours. I just think that these gods were nuts and bolts people like we are. And they just happened to know a little bit more. They were very, very wise and teachers of some kind, and they basically were elevated to a much higher status in society. It doesn't mean that they were supernatural or they happened to, fly between universes and dimensions. I think they were very physical people. I think it's a bit of both, because also we were much more in touch with nature. We had to. Because we had to rely on our instincts and also our intuition in order to survive. And when you get to that point, and the Aborigines, of course, will tell you all about this, is that when your senses are very attuned to your surroundings, like an animal, you will know how subtle things work. And if anybody has said that I could detect energy lines without the use of copper rods 10 years ago, I thought they were mad. Today I can see these things. I can measure them just using my hands. I know where they're flowing, whether they're positively charged or negatively charged. Even sometimes if I'm in the right frame of mind or not in the right frame of mind, I can even see what color they are. So it's something that you've learned. It's just like driving a car. You can pick it up, and the more you work with it, the better you get at it. And back in those days when we were attuned to the cycles of life, we could see these things. We realized that whenever we followed these subtle forces of energy along the land, these dragon lines, we found that there were certain pools of areas, certain vortices in the landscape which exist all around us where your body felt very different. It felt that you were interacting in different worlds. And you start getting visions and images and heightened states of imagination. And sometimes you'd even see and hear things coming into your mind. And I believe that's where the temples really came from. They were originally landscape temples. And if you follow that logic and then look at what happened after the flood, when in the Egyptian texts mentioned very clearly that after an incredible deluge, the gods embarked on a building boom of sacred places at specifically and carefully chosen locations. If you look in certain places around the world, and specifically on hills, which already were ancient sacred sites, you'll find today man-made temples on top of this hill. So in other words, as we began to lose that connection to the landscape, we began to build these temples so we could not just honor these places that were very special on the earth, but that we'd know where to go in times of trouble when we'd lose the plot, such as today. And this is why I believe so many of these incredible ancient places like the pyramids, they were built to last into our times, because I believe that they could foresee a time when we really will get so out of whack with nature, and we get so into our own ego, into ourselves, that we'd need to know where these places were. We'd need a focal point on the landscape to direct us back to the womb so we could go, oh, that's what it's all about. I'm actually connected to a much, much bigger web. And if I don't honor that web and I don't honor myself and the world around me, it's all going to fall apart. And I believe we're, with the attendance in sacred sites beginning to rise year by year around the world now, I think we're getting it. I think people are picking up on this need to reconnect with ancient places. And 50% of those people that go there, that aren't there for the pure tourist reasons, they do come out of there looking very different.
People do. They change. Yeah, you're right.
They do.
Right.
But you have to seek it. You have to be at least open to the idea.
Yes.
Because if you go in there as a skeptic, it will just evaluate exactly what kind of mental state you went in there with. So if you're a skeptic going in, you'll find exactly what you want to find, which is nothing.
Yeah, well, there are times I've seen skeptics change as well. If I may, let me share another experience with you that I had. This was at the Score Hill Stone Circle in, I believe it's in Somerset.
I love that place.
Oh, is it? Well, maybe you have a similar story. And I went in.
Glad you know it.
Oh, yes, know it very well. I made it a point to look it up when I was in between monster hunts there on Explore. And it's rather a bit of a hike, and it was March in 1989, and it was a typical English kind of drizzly day. I love the weather. I have a very austere taste in weather. And out to the circle, it's a bit of a hike, as you know, and whenever I enter a sacred place of any kind, I always ask permission and approach with respect, okay? And I did that. And I stepped into the circle, and everything you say rings a bell with me because that's what happened to me. You know you're in a different place, okay? I could not take a photo in there that was in focus, and that's a common phenomenon, even with my poor $1,200 digital camera. And I stood with my back against one of the larger stones, and the stones are seem to be different sizes. And I immediately had a sense of peace, but I looked out, and of course, distances on the moors, as you know, are very deceiving at times. It's very, you can lose your way very easily and all this sort of thing, a la Sherlock Holmes and the Hound of the Baskervilles and all that. And there was a line of horses, people on horses on the ridge that is, I guess, I don't have it right now, I believe it was toward the southwest. And they were just sort of going along, and they were not close enough for me to see exactly, who they were, what they were, but they seemed to be. It just didn't seem to be from our time, And maybe it was just somebody out riding, but it was a weekday and it was lousy weather. But then there were a lot of them, all in a line, not in the way that you do a hunt course, really. It's sort of just in a line. And I wondered, maybe it was a bit of a gift, and I felt privileged somehow. And I felt blessed from having been there by whatever powers there were. I think once you honor them, they appreciate that, and they give back somehow. That's as simply as I can put it. So maybe that rings a bell with you. I'm sure that you've had many more experiences of that sort. But I just felt very privileged.
True.
I felt very privileged.
It's very true. It's not a matter of worshipping. These places were never meant to be places of worship.
I found that out.
It's a translation error. It's, in Semitic, they're called Beth Arod. It means a place of workship. In other words, they're workshops. And you went there to basically connect with the gods, not because they were better than you, but they just happened to have a lot more experience. So they're teachers. And the true nature of a god or a pharaoh or something is literally the physical embodiment of the light, which is the source of everything. And the true leader, the true pharaoh, the true god, is someone who just guides and is there like a good friend to give you a helping hand whenever you need it. And when you go there with that kind of frame of mind, and you do go there and thank them for the work that they do for us behind the scenes, even though we take so much credit for it, that great idea that you had when you were writing something on a piece of paper, where did that come from? Science has never been able to establish that, but I can tell you pretty much that it comes from you asking for help on a subconscious level, and people around you say, hey, let's give this guy a helping hand. We'll put some ideas in his head, and we'll go out and write this. And suddenly you've got something on paper which is miraculous. And that's what happens in the sacred site as well. If you go there with that intent, with that honoring, you will be very rewarded. And yes, people see things all over the place. And I've been very privileged to see balls of light flying around the landscape. I thought people were nuts when they told me about this. And of course, it happens to you.
That's right.
The amount of times when a little voice in my head says, you really should pick up the camera right now. Now, I'm a professional photographer by trade, and I'll be looking around and I'm going, why do I want to take a picture of this? The lighting is horrible. And I'll get the camera out just in time to film a ball of light of this incandescent color flying right past me. It happens all the time. And so, yes, you do become much more benevolent towards life and everything around you, because you get out of your own ego, you get out of your body, and you realize that these places really thin the veil between worlds, and you are very loved at these places.
Very well put. And you're the guest. I'm just enjoying this conversation so much. I wanted to share one more little thing with you. And Ben, you were involved in that. When Ben was very little, I was very, very reluctant to take him to any of these places because he kind of grew up with this, with my paranormal research, and it wasn't until the third.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
The herb farm?
Yep.
In Connecticut. You were what, 7?
Yep.
8? And there was just something about this, the way the woman described it. She wasn't afraid when she called me. She said, there are things here you might enjoy seeing. Not the usual thing you get when somebody's got a ghost problem, quote unquote. So we went down and we took 2 of your friends, and we went down to this little herb farm in Connecticut. And they had identified all the energy sites on the property, and they had built literally a stone building with a little tower over the main site. And when you would stand in the middle of this little circle of flagstones there, you would feel so loved. And it was a healing place. I had an internal bleeding condition that was completely healed by simply standing in this place and just, letting go. And and Ben, I have a photograph of you standing, and you just have the most angelic smile on your face.
Yep.
And you were a good boy, but you weren't always an angel.
No.
And your friends as well. It was just the most, and it didn't want to even be thanked. It just wanted to give, which is a good lesson for us, And it's just, there are times when you have to leave the science behind. You put down the EMF meter and you just experience it.
Exactly.
That's all I can say.
We don't have all of the technology available to measure all the things that happen in the subtle world. And, you and I had this conversation with us earlier on about how, science makes these incredible leaps only when it discovers a way to measure the unknown. Until it has the technology available, it's nonsense as far as they're concerned.
That's right.
They should have learned this lesson by now. But
you'd think so.
Their science is determined by how much technology they have at their disposal, and that technology grows every generation. So, no, you're right. And creating sacred space is a very important way to go, and it's something I teach every day in my life.
Well, that's it. Well, Ben has a question here. About something.
I do. What are resonance cards?
What are resonance cards? These will probably be the ones that I have on my website. They basically were developed as a reaction to the hundreds of people that were having these incredible experiences in crop circles of healing. And it suddenly dawned on me that not everybody can afford to go over to Britain, especially when gas is $10 a gallon. And just buying a burger is about the same as a 5-star meal here in America. It dawned on me that you can't always go to the crop circle, so you can always bring the crop circle to the person. And at the time, I was actually doing some work with the Institute of Resonance Therapy, who had come over to Connecticut, ironically, to do a workshop. And I was learning about the power of radionics. This is a very, very ancient art. It's also a technological art. And it's used to basically treat people at a distance. Some people call it radiesthesia. The Germans call it resonance therapy. And it's about the transfer of information stored in something in one room and transmitting it across time and space to a person or a living organism somewhere within a part of the planet. And the transfer is to send information to this organism that it requires to rebuild itself. So in other words, when you and I are feeling ill and we're not doing too well, let's take cancer as a very extreme case. What happens during cancer is that the energy of your body basically has been diluted by some organism that is basically sucking the life out of it. Now, just like a computer, that would be like a virus. Now, viruses are treatable. You just have to have the right software. And what the Institute of Resonance Therapy found, which is based on very, very old technology that goes back at least a couple of thousand years, especially in India, is that if you have certain symbols which carry certain energy frequencies, you can put those into a special machine, which then transmits itself to the organism that needs to be healed, and they supply the missing software to that organism, and then the organism, once it has that software in them, they start to heal themselves. So I figured, interesting. They had told me that they were looking at the energy of crop circles and how we'd measured the subtle electromagnetic frequencies in the fields. So they figured that if you take a photograph and you don't change it of the crop circle, you should be able to capture some of that energy by default. So one day, just for fun, and the Germans rarely do things for fun, so when they do this, you really should pay attention. They decided to exchange some of the symbols that they had been using in their machine, which they've been using Sanskrit symbols, Hebrew symbols, runes as well. They decided to put a photograph of a crop circle in the machine and help treat a person that they were working with in Germany. And they found that it worked. And that's where I suddenly realized, wait a minute, the crop circle photograph contained the energy of the circle. But what if politics starts playing into the situation and people won't let you have the real photographs? And that's happened today. So being a graphic designer by trade, I decided to start making the symbols of the crop circles. Originally I'd done all of these because I was working on cataloging them anyway. But I had all these symbols of the crop circles, and they were extremely accurate. And I decided to put them together on cards, and I gave them to several practitioners, most of them are homeopaths, and also some massage therapists, all kinds of people who work in subtle energy. And I just said to them, work with these and see what happens. And I'm not going to tell you anything. I just want you to go off and play with them and see if it does anything to your patients. And the first person I gave these cards to in Boston, 5 minutes after I came into my house, I had a phone call on my message saying, "You better come back to the office. Something has happened." And they found that they were actually able to take these cards, put them on patients' solar plexus, and they were able to muscle test them and actually link and rebalance their entire energy system. And that's when I realized that these cards can be used for different things for different people, and they become quite popular. I mean, you can't get them off my website, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into. Most of them are to do with the fact that they have to be activated here, and the activation is very, very essential to all of this. But recently I was given the information from a scientist in Russia, in St. Petersburg, Konstantin Korotkov, who works with subtle energies, a highly regarded physician. And he took an interest in these cards, and he wanted to measure their frequency, their biophoton energy field. And I thought, great. So I gave him a couple of sets. I did not tell them that one of the sets was not active and the other one was, because that was going to be his control sample. And he found that in the active set, the biophoton field of the symbols is very active compared to the non-active set of cards. And that was very good validation. So that's why they work.
That's interesting. Now, people can get them from you, even though they're not available on your website, or can they contact you somehow? Or
you go to my website. There's a whole page and a half of information on the background of these cards. So
CropCircleSecrets.org. Yeah, okay.
That's right.
CropCircleSecrets.org. Okay. All right. Now, I also wanted to mention that many of the sacred sites don't include things other than temples and churches or circles. One of them is holy wells. It's something that's always fascinated me. So, what is interesting as well, too, and I'm sure, and certainly Freddy's aware of this, but the audience might not be, that when Christianity came along in Europe, it deliberately took pagan sacred sites, including holy wells, which might have been dedicated to various spirits or gods, and they Christianized them as a way for the people, especially when they had no choice, to become Christians. It made it a little easier for them, and this sort of thing. So it was a deliberate Christianization of pagan sites and pagan practices in some cases that were, as they would actually use the word, they were baptizing these sites or these practices. And this is a historical fact from church history. And many of the holy wells that we have today, say in England or wherever, were based upon pagan sites that might have been dedicated to, say, Saint Bridget, who you could trace back to an earlier goddess, and this sort of thing. And you take it from there, Freddie. It's your show. But I've always been fascinated by holy wells.
Yeah, the whole Christianization of sacred sites was, if you see it from one point of view, it's very easy just to say yes. It was a very superficial way of taking other people's places of worship and basically turning them into a new religion, which is what it was. Now, on one level, that is correct, and it's always been done for thousands of years. the difference that got me thinking was that people who basically superimpose these sites, and sometimes the actual stones of a stone circle would be included in the actual new building, which is quite amazing when you look at these things in Europe. Whoever did it, or most of the people that did it, maintained a connection to the original entity of the site, but also they honor the same type of entity, which, in other words, I'll give you an example. There's a sacred site in Portugal, not far from where my grandparents were born, which was taken over, Christianized. Basically, it's an enormous dolmen. I mean, these stones are over 25 feet tall. They weigh about 100 tons each, and the Christians put an oak door at the front, and they put a little bell tower on it. It's quite funny. And but inside there'll be a statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar, and you think there's nothing unusual about that. That's what the Christians did. Yes, it's true. But you know what? There are two feminine energy lines that crisscross exactly that altar. And for the last 5,000 years, it was a female principle that was worshipped at that place. So someone maintained a connection. And it was the same thing with the holy wells. I mean, there were places where people would go and get cures for all kinds of ailments, and certainly in Northern Europe, this is still a practice today, where certain wells are associated with specific myths and traditions, and right up until the Victorian era, doctors in London would send people down to Cornwall, which has one of the greatest amounts of sacred wells anywhere in the British Isles, except for Ireland, of course, which has a tremendous amount of them. They would send them all the way to London to be cured because the waters really did have healing properties. But again, these wells, again, are aligned on the crossing points of the Earth's magnetic lines of energy. And magnetism, which NASA has now conclusively proved, is very much attracted to water. And in fact, I remember reading something about 8 years ago on their website that said, and I quote, when we look for magnetic lines of the Earth's energy across the face of the Earth, we first look for underground veins of water, because the underground veins of water will pull in the magnetic lines of the Earth's energy. Now, why NASA were looking for these, I have no idea, but it does prove that our ancestors were aligning these things for very, very good reasons.
Certainly does.
So the connection is maintained. I mean, these things are very curative. And in the last 8 years, water from holy wells has been looked at under the microscope. And they found that compared to normal water, the water from sacred sites, holy wells and sacred springs, does seem to be much more active. In other words, they look at under the microscope and they find there are millions of little vortices which are vibrating in very fast frequency, much compared to ordinary tap water. So this water literally is holy, and I mean that with a W in front of it. It is whole. So when you're drinking that and your body is 2/3 water, it's going to energize you. It's going to stimulate you because the water has got magnetism impregnated into it. It's got certain chemicals in it. And, of course, it's going to do you no end of good. So, yeah, by all means, drink the water from holy wells.
Yeah, as I did. Now, this leads to a very basic question. What is it that makes something sacred? There are many levels to that question, I suppose. But let me start you off theologically. In Orthodox Christian theology, I mean the Eastern Christian theology, they have a very interesting concept that, and this goes way back, that you've got hydrogen and oxygen that make up water, the basic elements of the universe, particularly hydrogen, and everybody stands around and imposes positive energy upon it, makes it holy, and therefore, in a way, it kind of transforms the whole universe. I mean, this obviously it's not adequate to explain, but I mean, it's sort of an interesting concept and one that I think find kind of uplifting, and very much in line with what you just said. So, what is it, if in your definition, that makes a place holy or sacred?
I think it's actually in the origin of the word itself. It's whole. It's where everything happens.
Very true.
And the Egyptians actually, in fact, that is where the origin of the word actually comes from. It's like altar. 100 years ago in Europe, altar was being spelled with an E. It literally is a place where you are altered. And if you look at the origin of the original altars of the churches, the old churches, and specifically the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, they are exactly the point where the pagan sacred site used to be, and that's where you used to go to be altered. So it's not by accident that these things are called in the way that they are. And the Egyptians actually had a very good way of describing this idea of sacredness. and that was that a site or a temple could not be considered sacred unless it had been consecrated and used constantly for several thousands of years. Wow. And I think that's what it comes down to. It starts off as a place where, the veil between worlds is a little bit thinner than normal. As I said earlier, I mean, we were able to find these places just like that and go and sit in them and, connect with whatever you wanted to connect with. And over time, someone else said, hey, he's having a good time over there. Let's go and sit on that spot. And then someone else comes along, and another person comes along, and then you build rocks on it. Specific types of rocks are used for these temples. And the crystalline structure of those rocks remembers the reason why people go there, because it's full of quartz. And, of course, quartz is a wonderful material for imprinting information in. Mm-hmm. So over the course of thousands of years of constant use, the place becomes a place of sanctity. So you're building layers upon layers upon layers over thousands of years of pilgrimage. And that's what I believe the idea of sacredness really comes from. It takes on an aura of the people that have gone there before you. And if all those people go in there with the same intent, it builds up this immune system to the point where you can pick these things up from miles away. I mean, if you go to Stonehenge, I mean, you can feel the power of this site a long, long time before you've even seen it.
Oh, so true.
And that's the power of veneration.
Yep, very good. Well,
really comes down to it.
I'm afraid we have the final break of the show coming up, and we're going to interrupt Freddie here for just a minute. And when we come back, we're going to continue to talk as we have been, but we're also going to bring up the notion of the G word, the government. What is their problem? Okay, stick with us. Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on Achieve Radio. We'll be right back.